I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The first thing that we want to talk about here is the model that we're giving today, and most importantly, what counts as a commercial work. We think that this largely is referring to things like advertisements, movies, or TV shows, works primarily consumed for entertainment that might use these places as some sort of filming location or otherwise depict their images. People can obviously still come and take personal photos and post these online for non-commercial uses. And I think that news reports like filming the George Floyd protests or other things like that are probably not in this motion, as they're largely not commercial. We think that the actor involved here deciding whether or not to give these film rights is like the city or state government or some bureaucratic department therein making a decision on which image rights to use. And they can decide whether or not to offer those image rights to certain individuals based on certain conditions, i.e. like what do they plan to do with those images if they're filming like some sort of movie or TV show, how is that going to play out, what's the script like, things like that. They can negotiate that like a business deal on certain conditions. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is why do cities have the right to these images? Now just think logically here. Architects have copyright over to the buildings they make. Photographers have copyright over to the unique material that they create. We say that a city or other location is no different. That government that has planned, designed, and executed the creation of that place, it ought to have the rights to how those images are used in a commercial sense. This is really important to empower cities to take control over their homes. But even if you don't buy that they have a principled right to this, I think we'll prove the pragmatic impact given to cities under this right. So next, how does this benefit cities and other locations? First, we think that it is most beneficial in emerging cities and non-Western places. How do we think commercial images of these places are often used? First, they are often used to instrumentalize and profit off of suffering. This looks like nonprofits using their images in advertising campaigns to portray a racist image of these countries as destitute and in need of Western saviors, etc. Second, they're used in film industries, and we prevent racist tropes in film. Western cinema, i.e. Hollywood, has a long history of using non-Western nations as filming locations for their movies, but then ending up mischaracterizing the place that's being depicted. As an example, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom was literally banned in India for its portrayal of the country. It's safe to assume that with proper image rights for the filming locations that they use, they could have prevented this movie from being made in the first place by screening the script as part of these negotiations. Opp may say that cities can just solve for this with filming permits, but recognize one, that this doesn't solve the harm that we explained, and two, filming permits are not developed as strong in areas outside of like New York City and so forth, where they're often used as filming locations. And why is this bad? This creates a narrative that can be easily manipulated without the city or other location's consent. If you take photos, you can easily edit them and then create some incorrect portrayal of that place. This is especially true because people are more likely to believe what they're told via photos. This is why people have a really hard time questioning deepfakes or are just more moved by seeing photos than actual writing or other mediums. When we're creating a racist portrayal and removing cities' agency to control this, we're taking away the right to control the narrative about what that place is actually like. So what we do on SideGov is re-grant them that right. We think that preventing media, which has a huge impact on the way that people subconsciously think, from like promoting these sorts of tropes and harmful stereotypes, has a direct lead in to like preventing casual racism and microaggression and things like that. I'll take clarification from OO.
Yeah, super briefly, why aren't we including like documentaries that are made for money or news that is still broadly commercial because you have to pay for it?
I think that a documentary is like a separate thing from a news organization. I think that that documentary would still be included in this. And I think that it is critically important to consider that that documentary should be included, because oftentimes these documentaries are made from a completely biased perspective by Western filmmakers. And we think that having some control over how you portrayed is a good thing in the cases of those. I think that they ought to be included. All right, next thing, that this is good for local industry and employment. Oftentimes these media companies bring in lots of their own people into other places and operate entirely insulated from the local community. Often this is at the direct expense of the people who live there because it interrupts their day and shit like that. They come in, they make a fucking mess, and then they just leave. The impact of this is that with negotiations for image rights, these cities or other areas have the rights to ensure that their own talent can be involved in the operations of the production, allowing skills and experience to go to people who live outside of places like Los Angeles, i.e. you can't just bring a bunch of white people to film in Asia, and this gives way for people outside these productions to be of some benefit to the people there. Finally, we think that in larger cities and hubs like London, Paris, LA, etc., you just get more revenue for the city. I think that it is most likely that this money goes back into the city in the form of public development, support for the arts, etc. And this is really good because now the people who live in that city who are engaged in those sorts of like us and those sorts of public development are getting benefits that they can use to build up their own lives, their own skills, and make livelihood for themselves. And so on our side of the house, we give cities and the people within them good financial benefits and freedom and agency over their homes, which is something that they do not get. So I think largely what we're telling you, first of all, is that we allow cities to reclaim the narrative that is spread about them, as in we prevent Western people from being able to say racist tropes and being able to promote white savior narratives through the depictions of these places. We give them the ability to prevent that and prevent racism on our side. And we also give you real tangible benefits to people that are living in these cities who might be involved in these productions, instead of just insulating all that benefit to people who are largely just living in Los Angeles, already working in the film industry, probably already pretty well off if they've made it in these sorts of industries. So even if you don't buy principally that these cities are in and of themselves a creation of lots of different people who all put the work in, both on the government side and in the residential side, into making these areas like the way that they are, that they should have the principal right to control how they're portrayed, just like any other work of art, we give you the tangible impacts to how these cities are able to be benefited by these sorts of image rights. And so we're proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for his remarks. I call upon the Leader of Opposition to start off the op case and encourage you to just mention how you want your POIs if you do have a preference.
For sure. I would prefer my POIs in the chat, please. That would be excellent. I want to be pretty clear about why I think that opening government has framed themselves out of this debate. Opening government focuses largely on characterizations of cities and fictitious depictions. That is, things like movies, things that are largely commercial works of this specific sort. Two broad problems with their sets of arguments that come as a result of this. First, given that they are fictitious, movie creators and people who are producing this kind of cinema aren't tied to specific locations. That is, that they can pick one from many thousands of locations all over the world, meaning that all of the arguments that you hear from opening government on actually helping domestic industry don't really manifest, because people are able to engage in a race for the bottom. That is, that there's many more cities who are willing to have these people come in and actually film their city than there are cities that actually exist. Because of the way that the demand and supply is balanced, I don't actually think you're getting favorable terms for these people. I think that people will just go somewhere else if you're charging exorbitantly high rates. You're actually just going to make a nominal amount of money. You're not actually going to help the city that much. The second thing then to note is that I think with all these fictitious depictions, people aren't really tagging it to the city that's specifically identified. That is, that if there are harms about racist tropes that might exist in a movie that is portraying slums, I don't think anybody is tying it specifically to Hyderabad or Mumbai or Dhaka, right? I think people generally attach it to a nebulous conception that already exists. I don't understand what the delta is on their side of the house. It doesn't seem like white people who have a preconceived notion that, oh, Indian cities are poor and have a lot of slums really changes depending on which Indian city is portrayed in this movie. What we on Opening Opposition want to focus on is something that is drastically different. That is largely non-fictitious depictions of these cities. So first on the framing about why this is always going to be higher impact. That is, in non-fictitious depictions, what we're always talking about are things that are tied to that city's identity itself. That is, things about depicting protests, doing deep investigative series on talking about the way that systems have brutalized people of color in cities all across America and even across the world. We're talking about things like creating deep and cutting documentary series that will make cities, states, and nations look like they're in a terrible light because they aim to actually uncover a lot of the travesty, a lot of the violations of human rights in certain situations that actually are occurring. So on a weighing framework, then, I think it is extremely important because these mechanisms are oftentimes the unique way by which we're able to galvanize change. That is, it takes journalists with a lot of courage, it takes documentary filmmakers with a lot of courage to go into these countries and places where it might be dangerous and it might be difficult to get good footage, to get good information and a good story to tell about what's actually happening in order to expose the malfeasance and basically the malicious intent behind a lot of the actions that actually occur. So that brings me to the second question in the round. That is, when are image rights likely to be used in a way that is going to be bad? When is the control likely going to occur? Because I don't think that the nominal amount of money that opening government might make from movies is really what we're talking about. Because I think that it is cities like Kenosha that are actually going to be like, look, we don't want people coming in. We don't want people who are actually going to be looking and seeing the issues that exist in our city. We actually are going to prevent you from being able to use any pictures of this whatsoever if you want to do a documentary series on our police department. It is cities like Louisville who, after the Breonna Taylor incident, won't allow filmmakers to come in and do deep investigations on the way that their police department is horribly tied to their DA and their prosecutors specifically. Those are the kind of things that never get made on their side of the house because cities now have a monopoly that prevents them from actually ever allowing people to get in on the investigative level. So I want to be very, very clear. The reason this is so much more important is because I can't film a movie about Louisville's police department in, like, I don't know, Baton Rouge. Like, I can't go somewhere else and do those exact specific things. What I actually have to do is make sure that I'm in that location using those rights. A lot of stories and important narratives that are extremely important for uncovering both, like, corruption, but also, like, malicious intent and, like, the exploitation of large numbers of people rely on this kind of characterization, on this kind of depiction. This never happens on opening government. Basically, even if we conceded their entire case, I think we would still be quite far ahead, because even if there's the case that some racist tropes occur, they don't do a very good job of explaining what the marginal change is. We tell you that oftentimes these are the only mechanisms for actually uncovering the problems that exist. The final piece of positive matter I want to talk about in this is about the precedent that this kind of sets. So first, this sets the precedent that the right to free press and the ability of the press to check back against systems is likely to be controlled by institutions such as the state. That is, now the state can limit what the press is able to do. Understand that the press is an important check, right? And they say, look, some free journalism can still happen, maybe, but the most important investigative journalism that actually uncovers the cracks in the foundation of the state which we live in are extremely important. Like, the subscriptions to the Boston Globe went way up after things like Spotlight, because people understood that they were doing things like uncovering horrible malfeasance within the Catholic Church. I think those are the kind of things that can't happen when cities are like, no, you can't film here. No, you can't take any pictures of us. No, you can't use any of this material. And the second thing that happens is that it creates a precedent for the ability of amorphous organizations like states and countries to have rights on their image and perhaps rights on other forms of representation. Right now, there's only nominal protections. That is, we only have things like trademarks that exist that people can actually have a right to gain image rights or like some sort of compensation for. But now, if it's the case that amorphous entities like states and governments are able to say, look, if you take a picture of us, you can't use it, it means that when you take a picture of something like a corporation, like in a lab, and you're like trying to show some sort of like malicious intent, whistleblowing becomes almost impossible. That is, that if this sets the precedent, then now those entities also have the same kind of rights for the same principled reason that for all the reasons that opening government gives you, that they have constructed the entity that they are, that they specifically serve a very specific purpose and have constructed themselves in a very specific way. I think what actually ends up happening is opening government creates a world where you set a very dangerous precedent that prevents anybody from ever exposing information on these organizations. So really quickly then, on the weighing in the round. If opening government is correct about everything that they tell you, it is perhaps true that cities will receive some amount of revenue from image rights and be able to redistribute those things into the local economy. But on a weighing level, I think it is kind of laughable the impact that this would have. That is, that cities' balance sheets aren't dictated by perhaps the nominal amount of money they would receive from image rights. It is largely from things like state level contracts and taxes that they actually collect, right? So the impact here is extremely small with what cities are going to be able to do. But on the flip side, investigative journalism, documentaries, and exposing corruption through whistleblowing are all mechanisms that uniquely help to root out the problems that exist in our society. The impact on our side of the house is far, far more probable and also far, far higher. It's for these reasons that we're extremely proud to stand in opposition.
I thank the Leader of Opposition for his remarks and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to start off the debate, or to continue the debate for side OG.
Am I audible? I'm going to start with response to OO. First, why I think their case largely isn't true, i.e. you can actually access most of the documentaries and news sources they're telling you about. Second, response to why this is mostly why they're missing the short versus long-termist comparison, i.e. they're focusing on immediate short-term effects, which they probably don't actually access, and how we create better solvency in the long term that probably matters more than what they're talking about. I think we get three things out of OO. First First is that documentaries largely need to film here, and that cities are going to shut them out if they don't do this. So I think first recognize that many of the documentaries they're talking about are long-termist in nature, i.e. as soon as this scandal happens in a specific area, you likely aren't actually making documentaries on that until a couple of years or a significant time has passed. I think in the immediate short term, most of the coverage of that is coming on things like news sources and social media, i.e. when people want to come in and film a documentary on a city like Detroit, it's probably already happened after the conflict has happened. I think given that this is the scenario, I think they need to do more work to prove why this city is going to actively try to shut people out of this. Why is this so? I think on our side of the house, we tell you that news sources still have things like access to protesters live streaming, posting photos on social media. Secondly, you just have journalists and people posting about this online and writing news stories and already exposing this. So I think on both sides of the house, you probably have a fair amount of news stories and public attention to an individual action. What OP needs to do, and I think they fail to do, is prove why the actual commercial images of a city are so unique, i.e. why without these images, the documentaries are just never gonna happen and no one is ever gonna know that protests are happening in Flint, Michigan and stuff like that. I think they fail to do that. So if what you're actually caring about is making access to controversies that are happening in the city, I think we do it on our side of the house too. Thus, you default to the long-termist impacts that we give you. Yeah. Second, so I think we're clear that news sources can still do this and have other accesses to do this. But secondarily, even if you don't buy our scenario where we tell you that thousands of people are posting photos of protests online and that journalists are already recording it, secondarily recognize that large media sources like CNN and Fox News probably have the budget to incur the fine, i.e. if the city really does try to block them, they probably recognize that the financial outcome they get from filming these events and posting them online are probably enough to make the risk of filming it worth it, because I think it's unlikely that in these copyright suits you actually get slapped really hard, i.e. there's tons of copyright infringements that happen all the time with things like fashion and photography, etc. But the slapdowns you get from the court are never actually that high. So I don't think they're actually accessing the impacts they tell you, where suddenly you have no idea that there's a crisis in Flint. Yeah, because I think their unique burden on them is to explain why you uniquely need images in order to access what they're talking about, as opposed to just news stories and stuff like this. Yeah. Finally, I think a lot of what they're talking about will somewhat be defended by right to free speech and free press, i.e. that you can still film individual people having conversations in private areas and stuff like that. You can't just be filming photos of New York City as a whole, but you can probably you can't bar filmmakers from entering the city entirely. Yeah. Second argument is how it limits the free speech of the press. I think the burden has to be stronger in order to prove that you're actually limiting the free speech of the press. I think the burden is to prove why images are uniquely important to stories like this and why you can't access it otherwise. i.e. if we prove to you, you still have at least some access in order to show these stories, I think they aren't actually accessing their impacts. Most urgent news doesn't involve docuseries and things like this. We tell you it happens more in the long term. But secondly, you can use photos taken otherwise. Next argument is that it sets a bad precedent. I don't think this has the meaningful impact in the reading of the First Amendment, i.e. there's already a abundance of Supreme Court cases that are upholding people's individual rights to freedom of speech and stuff like this. I think it's unclear to me why this becomes the actual precedent that they're setting. I think finally companies can already use their maximum influence in an attempt to stifle out the callouts of these operations, right? Yeah. Finally, I think we tell you that the impacts that come to the city from finally, I think have some analysis about what the actor is, or what the city as an actor is going to do. Recognize we tell you on our side of the house, you probably already have a lot of people talking about the controversy. I think the actor analysis and the consideration of the city is to recognize that they probably get both one, some financial benefits, but two, recognize that if you deny CNN from coming and trying to film you, you're going to get a ton of press outrage. People are going to say you're trying to stifle free speech and stuff like that. You're probably not going to do it. You're probably just going to allow them to come in and perhaps grant them some conditions, but I don't think it's actually a meaningful infringement because I don't think cities are actually going to do this. I'll take closing. If you have anything. No. Okay, I'll take opening if you have anything.
Yeah, so our argument wasn't Twitter disappears on your side of the house, but what we told you is at the point where you put these images on larger platforms and give it that stamp of legitimacy, why is it that you don't think that that's necessary to further spread the images you want?
So I think that first, like you need to prove why uniquely you need to have people come in and like film this and create this themselves. I don't think you actually do this. There's lots of other ways that CNN can still do this image. But secondly, I think that like a lot of the way that people consume news is just like tweets and then like reporters retweeting things and just writing stories. People don't watch live news anymore. Like no one tunes into like news at 5 p.m. There's other ways to access this information. I don't think they actually prove any solvency on their side of the house. What do we tell you? We give you characterization about long-term impacts, i.e. recognize that everything they tell you is about the short term that has minor impacts, because I think at most it's a wash of everything they say, because we give you actor analysis as to why individual cities probably aren't going to like meaningfully change and block people out because of social pressures and like fear, stuff like that. What do we default then? The long-term impacts of the narrative you create for a city and the racism that trickles down to individual people. I think we give you a narrative that goes uncontested, that it's most likely to happen in like small cities, i.e. cities that are likely to be like abused in other ways. Tanae has two responses. First, that people go elsewhere. So if it is really true that people are so poor that they need this, then it's probably true, then we're fine giving them access, i.e. if poor cities are so poor, they're just going to accept it because they need money. It's good that we give money for them. Second, Tanae says that people are just going to go to other like areas. I think this probably isn't true. For lots of documentaries and films that specifically involve a city, it's just much easier and more realistic to actually film the city. What are the impacts of this? We say that on their side of the house, it creates a narrative that you can easily manipulate a city without their consent. You take photos of them, edit them, and then create an incorrect portrayal of the city. That's really bad, especially because people tend to believe what they're told via photos. So it creates a racist portrayal and removes the cities of their agency and autonomy to control this. I think it's really important to consider this impact because it's most long-termist, i.e. most of what they're saying on their side of the house probably doesn't matter, because after 3 years of a scandal, you're probably still going to get the documentary. This is the only long-term solution in order to first provide like monetary incentives to the city, but two, allow them to recontrol the agency over how they're portrayed.
Great. I thank the Deputy Prime Minister. Call upon the DLO to close off the front half of the debate.
Is everyone ready? What pushed most people to think that the Vietnam War was terrible was not reading broad statistics of what happened. It was watching how many people were trying to get on the last helicopter out of Da Nang. Specific images like this, like watching specific soldiers get killed because US intervention in other places was bad. Looking at the riots that happened in specific places. And look, they might say Twitter solves, and this might be a sign of my old age as some dino that maybe shouldn't be here. But I think broadly, a lot of people aren't on Twitter, and a lot of the people on Twitter aren't able to craft the kind of narratives that Walter Cronkite was able to create when he talked about the Vietnam War, that specific journalists in Spotlight were able to do when they talked about what happened with the Catholic Church, and they showed the agony that happened on people's faces and contextualized that in the way that they wrote it, rather than the vast wasteland that is discourse on Twitter. Like, I'm so sorry, but importantly, for the people who are actually looking at these policies, the governors, or the huge amount of voting base that is old people, they literally just aren't in that world. But also Twitter exists on both sides of the house, so they're not really winning out there. I want to talk about three things in this speech. First, why is it that cities won't use this in the way that OG thinks they will? If we can prove that, then all of their trickle-down racism goes away impacts they cannot access, because they need to prove that that's the way that cities would do it. Secondarily, taking them at their best and saying, even if that is the way cities use it, a comparison of the uniqueness of harms. I'm just going to say, like, Star Wars is bad when they portray racist aliens. Third, a precedent on the privacy of image rights. Why it is that the examples Andrew gave you about architects having a right over their building is uniquely different from, I don't know, a corporation or an organization or a state or a fucking country having a right over how they're portrayed. It's absolute nonsense. Before that, one super brief piece of rebuttal to some broad Americentrism out of OG. First, they're like, the Supreme Court broadly protects privacy rights. Like, this is only applicable in the United States. Lots of places don't have the kind of freedom of the press that they do, but also that's not the way that the freedom of the press would be implemented in the world, where you preempt that kind of thing with a law. Like, literally, your case presupposes that you have the ability to restrict this kind of freedom of the press at the point where you buy that is broadly commercial because you're making money. If they can just fiat journalism that you pay for doesn't exist, and the huge commercial incentives that Boston Globe gets when more people subscribe are not part of the debate, then fuck it, drop us right now. But I think that's nonsense. Also, documentaries largely solve, and that's probably there too. They can't just say we don't want to talk about journalists. Then the stuff about how it's like, the reason they won't, their single response to the argument Tanae gives you as to why it is that authoritarian places that don't want to be portrayed bad badly, won't kick out people is because they're afraid that there'll be blowback, that they pushed away CNN. Absolute nonsense. These places are run by conservative governors or authoritarians who have built their regime in a polarized world by saying that this is fake news and we won't have them changing the way they're perceived. That's literally what people in Louisville do, and that's the way that it is perceived. Three things. First, why won't cities use this in the way that OG says? Because look, they say that broadly the populace wants this, but the people who control developing countries largely are these capitalists. So a couple of reasons here. First, they want the money that largely comes from the movie being filmed there. That money is not the film rights that OG is talking about. Largely, it's the huge amount of taxes that you get. You get a percentage of the sales that the movie has, so they want that movie there. Secondarily, there's a prisoner's dilemma. That is that people who make these movies aren't like, oh, it has to be in Vietnam. We would say that most moviegoers will take any boat in a storm. Literally any Asian place that largely resembles China, they can just say is China, because white people who predominantly watch these movies don't know the difference and they just don't give a fuck. So it's deeply unclear to me why it is that they're just going to be so fucking afraid that, oh, if I as Vietnam say no for some kind of woke reason, then they'll just go to Laos or Brunei. So they're always going to be in a prisoner's dilemma where they say, fine, you can come in, I don't care you portray us. Secondarily, people who work there on the ground, who are oftentimes the poorest individuals in society that we want to care about, care more than the racist perceptions of white people. These are people who work in tourism, people who work in restaurants, people who work in utilities, people who are workers and rigs and hold the lights. All of these people get way more jobs in the world where that movie is filmed there and not filmed somewhere else. So these people will also push their governments to try and get that place there, because I think when those individuals who we care about are weighing these things, maybe us white people who think about contact theory are like, oh man, these people probably care most about the way they're perceived. But I think that the difference is whether they have a loaf of bread on the table or not. That is the way that they will want these movies here. But importantly, they're not even going to use it effectively. That is that the way that they will want to do it is one where developing countries won't want to show the slums there because they don't care about changing racist white perceptions. They want to play into them. They want to show that we're not developing countries. We're organized. So when Vietnam and these people want to film in the slums of Vietnam, the way it happens in GovWorld is Vietnam's just like, no, we want people to come here for tourism reasons. We'll only let you film in Hanoi and the richest white places so white people think Vietnam is a nice place to be. So if you believe that all of these mechanisms exist, then it is deeply unclear to me why it is that there will ever be, like, they just can't fiat that the way countries will use this is in a way that is woke. Secondarily, comparison of uniqueness. Even if you believe that the way that they use this is woke, what's the comparison? I think there is a huge non-uniqueness on the existence of racist tropes. That is that even if you don't film there, you could literally just do a sci-fi world like they did for Star Wars 1, where they had people who were clearly Japanese caricatures and everyone knew it, making fun of their accents and the way they looked, but they can say, oh, they're aliens. So it's deeply unclear to me why it is that OG is getting anywhere here, because you can just cop out. CG, go.
Tourism will not decline because you travel to a place once, whereas copyright is compounded. You see it every day on your TV. Big corporations pay you royalties. You get more money in the long run on our side.
I just don't think this is the case, right? Like, I think maybe that money goes to the people who get these royalties, like the people who are the highest up, but we would say specifically the people who have these jobs, the people who are the vast majority of people don't get those royalty rights. They do get the tourism that comes from, or just like the business actually going there. But also if the movie is portrayed, you get that same symmetric benefit. Comparison of uniqueness. We already told you why racism happens on both sides of the house because they can cop out. Uniquely, what Tanay tells you is this: you need money to fund long-term investigation. If the only journalism you have is non-commercial, then you don't have that long-term investigation. Secondarily, you have major platforms that have experts who know how to craft that narrative. So that's really important because you need to contextualize these images. And I already told you that these images are important because the way people perceive issues is on a human empathy level and not like fucking robots. So at that point, then it's deeply unclear to me why it is that authoritarian countries, or even developing countries that aren't authoritarian, aren't just going to want to shape the way that they are perceived in these places. Finally, third, on privacy, the broad principle. We only care about privacy, or the way that you are perceived in society, because for the people who do not have their own autonomy, they want to be able to act without being observed. Importantly, privacy does not apply to large institutions or places where people are broadly powerful, because if the reason you care about privacy is autonomy, and these places directly impact the autonomy and rights of other people because of the human rights abuses they commit, then like fuck privacy, because if the reason you care about privacy is autonomy, it's the autonomy of those people who they're caring about that we care about more. But also privacy is about the specific will of an individual. I don't know how like a broad conglomerate or corporation or the broad precedent this sets can coexist in the gov world coherently, because what is the singular will or autonomy that they're trying to protect? Why do we want to protect the will of large states or corporations anyway when they're fucking people over? We're fine with moving their privacy. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for his remarks and welcome the Member of Government to start off the back half of the debate for our side.
Just ensure one second. Could you pause for like 10 seconds? My speakers just died, so I'll connect another one.
Good to go?
Am I audible? Am I audible from this one?
A little bit. It's a little bit less clear, but
Am I audible?
yes, it's just a bit less clear. But it seems like
Can
you
you
can hear me.
can you turn up your mic settings?
You can't hear anything.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello.
Oh,
Okay.
Am I audible from? Am I audible
So
now?
we can hear you, but I don't think your partner can hear you. You can hear us now?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All good. Go
Yeah, just
ahead.
let me know
Sorry
if
for
like you can't. Yeah, just text if you can't hear me anymore.
Sure.
Let us know how you want your POIs.
Okay, everybody good to go? I want to start the speech off by addressing what we heard from opening opposition, because while on the surface I think it sounds like a good argument, it is easily defeated when you consider the reality of representation that they actually give you. It doesn't matter, they say in their speech, whether or not you film a movie about Asia in China or Japan. I think that analysis cross-applies to mitigate much of their own argumentation such that the case completely falls out of the round. What do we mean by this? So their entire case relies on one principle or one crux, right? That is, documentary series expose, you need these commercialized documentaries to make money such that you get these human rights abuses exposed. One, I think we can still report on crime, as opening government briefly mentioned, without implicating the entire locality. So for instance, there was still outrage when CCP documents were released showing how they were actually detaining the Uyghurs, even though no concentration camp picture was shown. I also think that it is very unlikely they're going to get these images in the status quo, because many of these countries we're talking about are actually incredibly isolated authoritarian states that journalists cannot even go into to begin with. Secondly, if you want to elicit the emotional appeal they want so much to talk about, I think you can do this through other means, right? They say it doesn't matter whether or not an Asian movie is set in China or Japan. Do you think the average American viewer can tell whether or not you show these bombing of, like, you show an American plane bombing like any country in Southeast Asia? You can reenact that and you can just portray it over Cambodia instead of Vietnam. I think this actually turns their argumentation, because if Cambodia is now the one negotiating with the American state and selling them the rights to that kind of representation, Vietnam has no say in it, right? Cambodia can also get a shit ton of money from that American documentary that is made about Vietnam but actually representing Cambodia, and then that can inject a whole lot of cash into their economy such that the Cambodian people on the ground are better off. Look, the media portrayal is not about whether or not every single sand, like every single grain of sand is like the Vietnamese grain of sand, right? It is about the general atmosphere people get from watching such documentaries. It is about the general sentiment people enjoy and people feel. The emotions that are being elicited does not have to be precise. Rather, it has to be an emotional approximation that galvanizes people into action. I think, largely speaking, opening opposition is out of the debate. Now, let's talk about our extension. And I think I want to flag something really unique here, right? Because opening government talks about how this would give economic rights to cities, and they also focus a lot on like Hollywood representation. The impacts of these things are not incredibly clear, and their mechanism for economic revitalization in cities is to expand industry. We don't necessarily want to expand industry all the time. We want this to turn into an independent industry that developing nations can use to protect themselves and their environment and ensure that people are not breathing in toxic waste from massive exploitation of natural resources all the time.
What is the problem in the status quo? Developing nations always prioritize economic development through natural resource exploitation and extraction and the huge expansion of industry at the expense of mass deforestation and other things that directly harm their environment, that pollute their waters, that poison their children. The impact of this is quite huge, right? The Amazon rainforest is actually literally being raised to raise cattle instead of preserve the natural integrity of the landscape and make sure people have breathable air, because it is actually more profitable to destroy these natural places in spite of their beauty, in spite of their use for the local population, and they can just earn more profit even though it is really, really economically inefficient. Second impact is, right, just the are examples like the massive expansion and destruction of riverbanks in Bangladesh that lead to increased flooding that destroy cities, but people can't always internalize this change because they always feel as though the environmental damages are far more down the line. They want to prioritize economic expansionism and giving people money on the ground. It looks like young boys and girls breathing in pollution, which means they maybe die like 10 years earlier, even though the necessary impacts of economic pollution are not seen immediately. How is CG the only team to address these disastrous economic impacts that make people's lives a living, breathing hell? I think we literally turn natural resources into an asset and we give people a reason to preserve these natural places. Now, I know this sounds like environmental arguments to the modern consumer who is really imbibed in capitalist society might not be the most intuitive, but I have several mechanisms as to why this would be incredibly successful. First, I just want to get a bit of framing out of the way, right? I think this is likely to be like pretty evenly distributed across the world, given that most places and most geographies and most towns, especially in the developing world, have a lot of natural like beauty that foreigners really like to look at, but they don't pay for in the status quo, right? Pretty evenly distributed. So mechanisms as to why this would be popular. First, industrialization means that people gravitate more towards natural resources and natural beauty. We want to see more of it as our society becomes more and more industrialized. Secondly, these images are already used all the time, right? Just think about the massive advertising potential natural resources have, like Mount Fuji water. When that water bottle company wants to put like a picture of Mount Fuji on every single water bottle, I think now they have to negotiate with the people who actually live around the area in order to maybe give them like a 1% cut every single time they have to use that image now, right? Thirdly, Hollywood movies, even if there are a lot of other places they can go to and you can negotiate the price down, at the very least, you have the negotiating power. But moreover, more specifically, whatever place they choose, they will be giving some cut of the profits of the movie toward them, right? So even if you're only making 2%, at the very least, if the movie becomes a box office success, that is a huge sum of money, especially considering the strength of the US dollar compared to a lot of other currencies around the world. I think that is hugely, hugely influential in terms of getting money into these places. Sure, I'll take an open opposition.
Yeah, look, even if you don't want to respond to our prisoner's dilemma argument, why do you think developing societies won't just say, oh, no bad things are happening because we have this one forest here, when they're massively deforesting the rest of the world and use their rights to hide it so that everyone thinks that they're doing fine and industrialization is not fucking over their natural.
Giving them an actual economic incentive to preserve large swaths of their land, right? At the very least, they're able to now earn money and they realize that it is really important for them to be able to sell these images as opposed to just destroying everything immediately. Fourthly, right? I think now you give activists an actual incentive to ensure that the environmental damage is not done. You can give them a reason to spend this amount of money. Notice that right now the environmental movement is facing a huge surge in the status quo with the rise of Greta Thunberg, with the rise of all these young activists, and also like literally a Green New Deal was just proposed, right? A lot of Westerners have a lot of incentive to spend money. Now you give them an actual mechanism to fund these places, to buy these commercial images in order to preserve that landscape and preserve that land. Fifthly, I think this gives you an opportunity to grow the tourism industry. And this directly clashes with the POI we just heard from opening opposition. Because when people now are imbued more with images, when you give people a reason, when you give these nations a reason to preserve their landscape, to publicize their landscape, naturally speaking, people want to go to these places more, which means you can't just literally deforest the entire area. You need to have actual tourist locations for first world individuals to visit. This is largely good because even if it is extractive on a commercial level, at the very least it preserves those landscapes. Look, what is the terminal impact of all of this, right? People's lives are preserved. You have 10 more years of life as a young boy or young girl growing up in a nation that is substantially less pollutive, that does not just pour toxic like waste things into a river and actually gives you the integrity to breathe healthy air. That is the impact we care about the most, people's health and people's ability to live a nice life all over the world.
I thank the member of government for remarks and call upon the member of opposition to continue the opposition case for the back half.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, cool. Just getting my paper sorted. Okay. Sorry, my computer's just glitching out real quick.
Take your time.
Okay. We think this debate matters where Israel can shut out documentary makers from coming in and covertly reporting on the occupation of marginalized individuals. It looks like authoritarian states and places where the most marginalized are oppressed and have their rights taken from them never get their stories heard, and the world never sees it. That's where this debate takes place. I'm going to extend a lot off of what O gave you because I think they missed a bunch of key things. First, a few pieces of extremist rebuttal. Firstly, on the racist characterization that we get from largely OG and what they base their case on. O gives you a lot of good responses. Here's another few that I think are more persuasive. One, we think that there are incentives that exist right now in 2020 not to do it. That is to say that Indiana Jones isn't what movies are made like right now, and here are some of the incentives not to do it in 2021. We think cancel culture has created an incredible deterrence against being incredibly misrepresentative of groups, i.e. social media makes it far more accessible for people of these places to speak out and say how problematic it is, and a lot of other people buy into it. Secondly, like the filming rights within these areas allow for them to dictate anyway, but thirdly, there are market incentives to be more authentic. That is to say, given that the arts have become far more accessible and studios have a lot more money to make money and compete against each other, they probably have an incentive to be the authentic movie and representation when film critic review sites review them. Also keep in mind, this policy is retroactive. That is to say, historical racist characterizations have already been made, and I don't know how Gov essentially reverses it. So even if you stop it wholesale now, I don't know why there's a reversal of that narrative and perniciousness. Okay, then local industries that CG bases their case on. One, just because the city or state gets this money, I don't know why they necessarily give it back to the people instead of maybe putting into the police force to repress the people more, or why the funds from this industry will be large enough to fucking replace natural resources that their economy is based on. Thirdly, keep in mind that like the places dependent on natural resources won't switch because the industry itself has political capture over the government and its choices. So like the people who are in bed with the industry won't like allow it because then they'll literally get killed. Fourthly, like also this impact on climate change is ridiculous, right? Like climate change is a collective action problem. Like even if this is true and we buy them at their best case, I don't know why the US and China aren't going to shit out pollution anyway and like turn the world over its head and like fuck them over with climate change in the next few years. That is to say, climate change isn't isolated. It is always, the impacts are distributed. Okay, what is our case then? Firstly, why cities and states actually have incentives to prevent the worst kinds of human rights violations from coming out. Firstly, keep in mind, like the tourism analysis that they talk about essentially means that's an argument for our side insofar as this is a direct incentive for you to not tell people when you are putting people in jail or when your police force is actively assaulting and raping the population or when you are literally committing the worst human rights abuses possible. And this does happen in just don't know about it as much. Secondly, foreign policy. Keep in mind, lots of aid that regimes are dependent on and how the aid sending dependent on how the aid sending country perceives that country. Voters are unlikely to support sending money to these places when they believe they're repressive. And like trade and military deals are also important on the public perception of how they vote for politicians there. And they have like an incentive to maintain hold on power domestically through ideological control. They probably don't want competing characterizations going out to the public. Finally, just the soft power relations they have to other countries probably makes them have less soft power insofar as the other countries can use this as like a bargaining chip saying, I want to do this because we found out how shitty you were. Okay, what are the roles that commercial works actually play in people's perceptions, getting the change and the awareness that OO based their entire case on? Firstly, keep in mind the pervasiveness of entertainment. So even if you don't buy OO on documentaries, and we're going to extend right now, entertainment on its own is incredibly pervasive. It's the songs that you listen to, the movies you watch, the shows you binge, the videos on YouTube. It is literally everywhere and anywhere. And I think when you have more accurate displays of what these regimes essentially commits, like in rap songs, when they talk about like what Israel is committing to Palestine, that permeates the public and goes to a lot of people when they otherwise wouldn't be access it when like they don't read the New York Times every day. Secondly, why documentaries are actually effective uniquely. Firstly, documentaries are just far more prevalent than they were before, so more people are able to access these accurate depictions. See, for example, Netflix, how more people watch documentaries now because the informational barrier to them has been reduced, and it's so cheap to access and you don't have to look for them because they like show up on your Netflix timeline. Secondly, you get more competition. You allow smaller and medium filming companies to do it when the barriers of entry to do it are reduced because they don't have to like figure out, like get like signing rights for it. Thirdly, why specifically film companies are important and not like CNN or New York Times, like OG tried to say. Film companies are in the business of making it appealing to the audience and interesting. That is to say that they have incentives to make as many people as watch it while also keeping it informative and accurate. So you appeal to far more people to get access to this information and see the truth that's happening. Fourthly, film company documentaries cross political divides. If CNN or the New York Times does it, you shut out such a large portion of the population and they just don't watch it because they think it's false. But also private companies just don't have political affiliations. So like everyone, even conservatives, have Netflix and YouTube. Finally, just the visual effect of these documentaries, right? The reason why you can't read it on the news is because when you see it in a documentary and it's pervasive and you didn't expect it when you're watching Netflix, cuts against the grain and pulls on your heartstrings otherwise than when you just read it on your Facebook post when you're scrolling through social media. Before getting into the actual impacts of this, why you should weigh this out, I'll take opening. OG, yeah.
We tell you that there exist checks in these cities, i.e. if you ban documentaries, it will make you look suspicious and result in more journalists coming to investigate you, especially in authoritarian areas where there's already limited free speech.
I just don't think that's necessarily true, right? Like, I don't think because like you don't see like that many Netflix documentaries, CNN is like, oh, now I really, really want to go in because I haven't seen a documentary on Cambodia anymore. I just don't think that's sufficient rebuttal. Okay, what are the impacts then? One, people's stories are not heard. Even if we get absolutely no big change at all and we don't change any dynamics, we think people who have had their parents killed or their house taken away get to know that the world knows what happened to them. This is massive victim empowerment when the world sees it, so it proves to them that they've happened and they feel heard, like they're not alone, and that other people recognize what happened to them is shitty and they're not isolated. Secondly, keep in mind that this prevents critiques of the city and government insofar as one, people literally just know about it less and the government gets to literally just shut it out. You get to prevent critiques domestically that otherwise would have happened that are important within that community. So like these places aren't homogenous. There's also a modicum of like minimal resistance. You shut that out entirely. Thirdly, there's less awareness of the actual problem. You get less donations to groups and NGOs fighting these things and creating the change on the ground and social movement insofar as people don't know that they exist because they've been shut out and you haven't heard about it. And just fourthly, like this also just creates deterrence, right? Like if people can go in and make a documentary and you didn't know about it because it's not CNN telling you that they're coming in, you probably have an incentive to make it a lot less prevalent insofar as you don't want a lot of people to be seeing these things. Look, I think we win insofar as we tell you how we empower victims and make the truth come out more. Don't give them this power. Incredibly proud to oppose this motion.
I thank the member of opposition. Call upon the government whip to close off the debate for SideGov.
Am I audible? Where's the phone? Starting in 3, 2, 1. It was incredibly telling that the entire opposition bench only talked about documentaries, as if movies, as if works of fiction, as if nothing else is in the commercial work. That tells you that's a losing side that tried to stand on to one fringe part of a massive thing. This is an incredibly clear government bench win, and I'll convince you why. But before that, how should you judge this debate? One, on uniqueness. There's a lot of overlapping arguments on both sides. I think closing government gives you the most unique benefit. Even though it's uniquely situated, I think this is the one benefit that we can all agree upon. Secondly, this benefit would otherwise cease to exist. It's incredibly difficult for developing nations to protect their natural reserves or indigenous tribes in the Amazon to get any commercial benefit whatsoever without just wrecking over their indigenous ancestry or land. At least we give them an alternative to turn their natural reserve or turn their way of life, culture is also a part of this debate, into an asset class that compounds. Because you see it on TV every day, and corporations have to keep paying them because it's part of the brand that the corporation created retroactively. Thirdly, I want to clarify the strawmanning that's being done because they literally have no rebuttal to the case. It's not about not having fossil fuels at all. It's about particular places being able to extract some commercial benefit from something they are endowed with. It's about an opportunity to turn natural reserves into an asset class for the first time in history, about curing a market failure where like natural beauty is something we take for granted, or for indigenous communities we just fetishize them, portray them as exotic without ever giving commercial compensation to them. It is more than just not extracting fossil fuel. We will not be strawmen in the debate today. A few arguments. Firstly, I'll briefly talk about CO there as well. No, as a matter of fact, I'll talk about CO first because I think it was largely a rehash. Their biggest rebuttal to our case is that there's no guarantee that indigenous people will get their share of the profit. This is the exact thing Walmart chooses to say that poor people in Bangladesh will not get more money. It will be taken away by garments owners. It's not about whether people on the ground get more money or not. We have to do what we ought to do. We ought to give compensation to the nation, and hopefully the nation will redistribute it to the poor. But states can renegotiate this pay, right? I mean, the state of Everest can ask the Nepalese central government to give them this money. There are internal mechanisms as to that can be achieved. That rebuttal should not be credited. Secondly, they say a bunch of stuff about entertainment and appealing to the audience. I will deal with that in my OO comparison because I think it's quite similar. You should not credit their impacts of stories not being heard or less donation coming, because I will tell you why you get adequate representation within the frame of our policy. O and briefly CO as well. O's first claim is that it's a race to the bottom. That's a zero-sum argument because we think most cities will not degrade themselves for money because dignity is really important, self-respect is really important. That's why Kazakhstan did not want to associate themselves with the movie Borat after they felt that dignity was trampled upon. But secondly, at least some people can protect themselves, right? Just because some people will degrade themselves and treat away their privacy does not mean no one should have privacy. That's a ridiculous fallacy. Secondly, commercial work, they say that this is important. I would posit commercial work, more often than not, misrepresents issues than accurately portrays them. They sensationalize issues. It has little informational value. It's mostly emotionally charged, and that's a work of theater, right? I mean, the Vietnam War helicopter scene could be shown from
It cut out for me.
Yeah, me too.
What time do you have?
I have 3:40.
I have
3:30.
Sorry?
3:30?
3:30, yeah. Okay,
So
me
for
too.
10 seconds. Okay, I'll just start.
3:30, yeah.
Obviously, but water and start with 10 seconds back. Sorry for this. Okay, starting. Yeah, so commercial work more often than not misrepresents, right? They usually just use it's emotionally charged. It's a work of theater. I think that work of theater can be replaced in a close substitute. Notice that this probably hurts. Like this might reduce the impact of OG's case because they talk more about like, I don't know, cities and like livelihoods. It doesn't impact our case that much because our things are like non-exclusive, right? You have to show the Everest. If Everest is on your logo, you can just not, I don't know, show Kilimanjaro or something. That image will not be the same anymore. So in our case, the images we talk about are like non-replaceable. Maybe to some extent OGs might be. But you can also use close substitutes, right? If you want to talk about Chernobyl, you can shoot it in Siberia. Heck, you can even use CGI. Like Pat Hanrahan got the Turing Award for this. CGI is great in modern day. Work of fiction can be replaced. But secondly, entertainment, information through entertainment is the biggest case of propaganda ever. It's probably better that people read a book on the Cold War, rather watch Hollywood, the biggest like US-centric propaganda machine in history, talk really evil about Russians. I'm not really sure why commercial work is the best source for getting informational value. So if accessible information is bad information, that is worse. And that is the weighing you should take in this debate. CO cannot just say more people get information, right? Or it makes it more appealing. This more appealingness sensationalizes news and makes it harder for people to not have discord. That's a bad outcome. Sometimes it's better that, people would have read a book or people would have simply read the news instead of watching a movie about the Cold War. Then they say news is commercial. Like, I think you had a lot of material on why that's not true. Engineer tells you print media exists, CCP documents can come out. We told you how oftentimes images are unavailable to start with because of security reasons, but open source media can also exist, right? So there are free newspapers, government newspapers, Envoy Times can simply cite those open sources. OG gives you a wealth of material as well, that social media is a bigger platform for news, and independent journalists can simply just post it there and people can get it. The thing is, you can get the emotional chargedness of an image from social media, but for informational value, you can go to New York Times and read about the CCP documents. Both of these things are not exclusive. You can have it from different sources, right? You can learn the substance from print media and do it and get the emotional value from other places. Why is our extension absolutely debate winning? Because we were the first side that told you how there's compounding profit on our case. If Everest is on your logo, there's an expectation from consumers that Everest will be on your logo. You will have to keep paying Everest for the next 70 years. That's an outcome. Like CEO tells you, this is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. Exactly, that's why you have to keep paying these places. We also tell you how in recessions, there are budget cuts. The first place you take away funding is from an indigenous reserve or from a natural reserve, right? That basically means that these places will have more self-sufficiency in their funding, will be able to protect themselves. So things like the EPA getting defunded will not harm them to the same capacity anymore. Finally, for the first time ever, things we have taken for granted as a civilization will have an asset value. They will be able to self-sustain themselves. They will be able to get commercial benefit out of something we as a society have benefit from, but have been taken for granted. And finally, on the point of the principle, right? I think the biggest strategic framing of the principle is that an individual right to privacy cannot exist without a collective right to privacy, because collective tropes affect us all. That's why representation of our society matters, how representation of myself my right to exercise representation. So if you think privacy is fundamental for the individual, it has to be fundamental for collective as well. Extremely proud to stand in closing government.
I thank the government whip for his remarks and call upon the opposition whip to close off the debate.
Am I audible?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Sorry, I just got a grade for a final and I haven't seen it yet, so my heart's kind of racing. But we'll deal with that after the speech.
That's relatable.
Let's not take 2 L's in a row. I'm taking POIs in the chat, but I'll be honest, guys, I don't know how many you'll take. Don't hate me. It'll be fine. With that being said, oh, good debaters, how much you suck. All right, beginning. It is important to note that nations are not benevolent. At the point where a country needs to weigh out between power loss and critique from domestic and international groups, the helping out their own people and trickle-down economics, we literally tell you that nations probably won't. We have no real analysis other than what we think should happen from CG, but note what Ahmed tells you as to why that probably won't happen. It is critical to recognize, as much as I want CG's Green New Deal idea of rights being transferred to actually happen, we think states actively won't at the point where they can suffer critique and suffer other larger economic losses in aid, so on and so forth. I think Ahmed lists you those impacts. It's just critically important to outweigh on them. I'm gonna give you a lot of messy weighing, but that's my go-to standard to tell you why we think it's important to recognize. I think there's something really quickly to recognize about truth and the importance of images, because I think Ahmed says this, but it's not really flagged and responded to, which kind of hurts my feelings. Look, truth, images are visceral. You literally can't hide from them. You can't hide behind flowery words and big, fucked up understandings of what we think death looks like or what it looks like to be harmed. You can't hide by words and images. You have to accept the reality when you see it. This looks like when you have news organizations saying police were hurt or berated or were stuck in a corner and therefore hurt Black Lives Matter protests, then looking at them seeing active batons hitting people who are unarmed. It looks like not being able to hide from the truth that other news media print sources want to feed. That is the reason why images and documentaries are not equivalent to having news sources or having the Boston Globe write something, because you can't stomach the idea of seeing it, because once you see it, you can't not believe it. You can't be around and be fake news, deep fakes. I don't think anyone's really turning around saying every image is a deep fake. If so, I think you need a lot more analysis to why you buy into that. I think people are more likely to say fake news or this is being over exaggeratory. It's like my Facebook post. I don't know, man. I just don't think I think that's the unique difference to images being important. So then when we get this an idea of you get this idea of like you probably have like the difference between also like, and I'll get to the difference between news and documentaries. Like news can be less accessible just because of like language barriers and the amount that you can actively reach out. I think platforms for documentaries are just easier for most people to access. Note all the analysis that Ahmed gives to us. You're like, I don't know, maybe like Netflix and chill and watch a documentary. You do you, but more importantly, you probably can access them more on that side. Not now in Shia, I'm so sorry. Look, this idea we get about like how truth is inaccessible, right? And they say like you should probably read a book. And I think CG runs the case of like you should read a book to do so. You should do a lot of things in your life. You should not be debating on a Monday at 3:23 and all of you should be at fucking class right now, but you're really not, right? Because we all make really crappy prioritizations in our life, but more importantly, you can hide from that. You don't have to. People just don't read the news. You have a comparable more amount of eyes on our side of the house. It is important to recognize we will sacrifice equality of you not knowing every single part of a conversation at the point where eyes are being presented, where the voices of Black minorities, the voices of Kashmiri citizens are not being shut out because people are looking at the harms that the Indian police are doing. That is unique incentive because you are entertained by the cool visual effects and the creepy sound noises done on like the Social Dilemma project. You aren't entertained by a 10-page paper as to what is happening. You're more likely to click off. You're more likely to not be engaged. It is critical to recognize that every eye is necessary and collective action power. That is why we outweigh CG. Importance as to why we think we knock out like OG, and I'll tell you why, like importance of visceral truths. Like OG tells you a few things. They say you have a right to these areas because people need to change mischaracterization. This doesn't engage with what Ahmed tells you. This characterization already exists. You need to prove to us why getting rid of this will actively turn that around. Like, look, people recognize somehow magically that like India has more than one place now, but the idea of slums still existing has not changed, right? Or the idea that like I'm somehow Pakistani because I'm brown has not changed yet because we don't think that you can get a reversal on that. We tell you why you probably stopped the prevention of new ideas because of like cancel culture and other mechanisms. I don't think we have a sufficient response to that. I think that's a critical enough check back, but fine, even if pervasive logic still exists, we'll weigh that out to like active harms being pursued and prevented. We think just on the idea of like active harm being presented, I think you have to weigh out like lives being lost and like losing the ability to see that versus maybe like someone reaffirming to themselves a belief they already have. I don't know that reaffirmation actively happens, so I just think that's a way out. Also the idea of like people, like I think they tell you themselves, right? People are likely to believe what they're told by photos. Incredibly why you think to vote up, right? Because that's the literal way that you probably weigh into most of this. They also tell you about like long-termism and how documentaries probably won't cause change. That's the best impact to tell you about how you probably can't change the narratives of cities. Look, you do though, right? I think with the new ability for technology and also smaller companies who can actually prioritize only doing one thing and spending all the resources to do so, that's how you get critique quickly about like a quicker critique about these areas. Even if the critique comes a year later, we think that's still actionable critique. You can still get someone fired from the DA's office. You can still change policy. We think that's critically important, not yet to both of you. Why then do I think we weigh out on the ideas of like of this idea of like what we get from OG as to why like other methods are not effective? Because OG's question is like, well, if you limit these problematic things, people are just going to question this. Look, here's the important though, right? Two things. One, I think you already know these areas are shitty. You already know China's shitty. You already know like Burundi is shitty. That doesn't matter about proving that someone is crappy. You need to prove what they're actually doing, the magnitude, and how you can respond to it. It is not just knowledge of a country being repressive. It is knowledge of what they're doing and how to actually be changed on that. That is what knocks out the entire gov bench on there. I just think it's critical. Also, documentaries are universal. The accessibility of that is much more important than like the short-term impacts they give you, actually, that we give you and tell you why they're better. Before moving on, I'll take OG for like cross-diagonal. I'm sorry.
Yeah, in the worst authoritarian regimes, photographers already aren't allowed in school, so there's no change because there's never any photos. In other cities, journalists exist, so cities aren't going to risk backlash from bans when journalists already reveal abuses and there's a marginal difference on their side of the house.
This debate isn't like North Korea via the US, it's three things. It's people knowing active things about documentaries and actively having to deal with that because they're more likely to actually do action upon that because they recognize the images being done. They can just theoretically think about someone being harmed. You want to watch it because people are sharing that link with you. But two, it's about India holding up Kashmiri internet, who is quote unquote a democracy, but like fuck Modi. Absolutely, I'll say that on like recording. But more importantly, I think that's the critical difference. It's engaging in most of that. Analysis. I think that it actually is a lot of weighing on that. We tell you four major things. One, we tell you even if it's not documentaries, like other media producers are showing specific atrocities, like Luke Fiasco rapping about Israel occupation of the West Bank. It's pervasive to people who otherwise didn't know and didn't want to engage with it because people who don't already read the news choose choose not to. I think very select amount of people want to sit there and scroll through it. 2, why documentaries are uniquely effective. We tell you the critical impact as to why accessibility is important and why more people seeing visceral images impacts into the idea of helping minorities that Ahmed gives you that's unresponded to. 3, where these benefits matter. We tell you, 1, you get victim empowerment. 2, you get critiques of the government that are actually longstanding. And 3, deterrence when you know that people like media companies can come after you. But 4, more importantly, why governments actually have incentives to prevent these abuses being shown, because it's ideological control. It's the idea of not having resistance. It's foreign policy. And it's just having the ability to not be checked. We are the only people to engage with every team on any case they want to tell you and tell you why you need critique, you need images, you need conversation, you need representation, you need to value them. And if we lost, I'll lose to this damn group.